Welcome again. We are now covering the material on homicides and gun violence, which is related to your last writing assignment. First, I want to show you one of the short film clips I posted on Blackboard. It's about 6 minutes long. I'm going to show you the first minute or so, and you can watch the rest on your own.
There are many different types of guns: rifles, shotguns, machine guns, revolvers, and pistols, to name a few. Historically, Americans typically owned firearms for hunting, and for most of the last century, rifles and shotguns far outpaced the sale of handguns in America. But today, Americans say their single largest reason for buying a gun is self-defense. Handguns are now the gun of choice in America, particularly ones designed to be concealed. Concealed carry, as it's called, is legal in all 50 states, and today an estimated 13 million Americans are licensed to carry a concealed weapon. That's more than 12 times the number of police officers and detectives. So how did so many Americans start carrying guns in everyday life? Well, the story doesn't start in the Old West. It starts in the late 1970s. In 1977, at the National Rifle Association's annual meeting, a faction of conservative activists led by Harlan Carter seized control. Carter pivoted the NRA away from the traditional focus on hunting and sportsmanship and transformed the organization into a political vehicle for the modern gun rights movement. Hunting was declining as more people lived in cities, and the number of households with a hunter has dropped by nearly 50% in the last 4 decades. The American gun industry survived this decline by selling more guns for carrying in everyday life. The narrative of the gun industry was changing. Some of the most dedicated gun rights activists went from saying this in 1967.
There is absolutely no reason why out on the street today a civilian should be carrying a loaded weapon.
To this in 2016.
If we had guns on the other side, it wouldn't have been that way. I would have, boom.
In 1987, the refashioned NRA successfully lobbied lawmakers in Florida to
So I'll pause it here. You can watch the rest of the short clip on your own just to make this video a little bit shorter. From the 538 webpage, they compiled this fantastic interactive graph which sheds light on every type of gun violence death in America. I'm going to go through each slide here so that you have an appreciation for the different types of gun deaths that routinely occur in the U.S. So more than 33,000 people are fatally shot in the U.S. each year. We tend to focus on terrorism and mass shootings, police officers killed in the line of duty, and police shootings of civilians, but you can clearly see it makes up such a small proportion of total gun deaths in the United States. 2/3 are actually gun deaths by suicide. More than 85% of suicide victims are male, and more than half of all suicides are men aged 45 or older. Another third of all gun deaths, about 12,000, are homicides. Most of them are victims that are young men, and 2/3 of those victims are black. Women are unlikely to be gun homicide victims, only about 1,700 of those 12,000 each year. Many of them are domestic violence incidents. It's about 500 accidental deaths per year related to guns. So you can see that the common element is a gun, but each of these problems are quite unique and might need different solutions to solve them as well. So there's an accompanying article to this interactive page, which is part of your required reading in Blackboard, so please read it on your own. In the article by Max Fisher, they conduct a case study comparing gun control laws between the US and Japan, which is suggestive of why Japan has the lowest homicide rates in the developed world and why the US has the highest. Japan experiences roughly 0.0 homicides on average per year compared to our 3.2 rate. In other words, you're about 32 times more likely to be killed in the US compared to living in Japan. In this PowerPoint slide, you can see the onerous restrictions Japanese laws have imposed on their citizens if they want to acquire a gun. And not any gun, right? There's only two types that can be obtained, and they are the types of guns that are not typically used in homicide incidents within the US. What I want you to think about is, one, do these gun restrictions have a relationship to the number of homicides in Japan? Or can their extremely low homicide rate be a reflection of the Japanese people only? In other words, are they just less violent people? Or is it both? And two, can Japanese gun policies realistically be applied in the US? If not, can some of their policies be applied and actually be effective? Back in 2011, they had 11 homicides, which was a national travesty. Again, compare this to us, we had about 12,000. In the New York Times article on Chicago's increasing violence rate, we see that their local gun control laws, some of the strictest in the nation, have not been able to thwart gun violence in the city. As you can recall from the Vice episode we watched at the beginning of the semester, Chicago has been experiencing a rise in violent crime, while the rest of the nation and its large cities have experienced a precipitous decline since the mid-1990s. Well, what the hell is going on in Chicago then? Gangs and factions are certainly the foundation of the problem. Having hospitals that are too far away from where most victims are shot is another factor. The author in this piece, Monica Davey, also reports on research that demonstrates most of the guns acquired by street gangs and used in homicides in Chicago are emanating from one gun shop just outside the city where gun laws are very relaxed. Chuck's Gun Shop is responsible for 20% of the guns that are sold illicitly on the streets of Chicago. Many of these guns are bought through straw purchases, such as a girlfriend of a gang member who buys 10 handguns at one time. Accompanying this article is this incredible mapping project the New York Times conducted. Let me pull it up here. They mapped where 50,000 guns on the street of Chicago actually came from over a 10-year period. Notice that every state is responsible for at least one gun recovered in Chicago. In a country where movement is fairly easy between states, this shouldn't be a surprise. People travel or they move and they bring their belongings with them. But where do most guns come from? Scroll down a little bit. If you guessed Illinois and neighboring Indiana, then you're right. About 60% of all guns come from those two states, which supports crime prevention research that offenders will not travel very far or work very hard to obtain guns or commit crimes. What's also very interesting is that about 8% of guns came from Mississippi, which is not bordering Illinois. Could you guess why? I'll pause here. There was a huge migration from Mississippi to Chicago between the 1940s and the 1970s, in large part as a search for jobs. Guess what they brought with them? Their guns. And guns that were brought to the city decades ago are still being used in crimes today. What's really interesting about Chicago is that it is the third largest city in the U.S., but experiences the highest homicide incidence. In fact, over 60 people were shot over the July 4th weekend in Chicago. Compared to New York City and Los Angeles, where they also have very tough gun restriction laws, Chicago experiences a much higher rate of homicides. You are nearly 3 times more likely to be killed in Chicago as you would be in New York City, and a little more than 2 times more likely to be killed in Chicago than you would be in LA. All 3 cities have similar gun restriction laws, so how can you explain this? Read the entire article for clues. In the landmark study on understanding homicide patterns, the PDF called A Tale of Two Cities, the authors, in this case medical doctors, are comparing one city from one country to another nearby city from another country. The demographics in both cities are very similar to each other, so despite being in different countries, the people are not that different from one another. As a side note, this is a problem when you compare homicide stats between one country and another country, even if they are both highly developed. It is possible that the people are different from one another, and if there are any differences in the respective homicide rates, it may have little to do with gun restriction laws and have more to do with the nature of the people. Compared to neighboring cities from different countries, is able to overcome this serious limitation. So in this study, the authors find that over a 7-year period, crime rates between Vancouver and Seattle do not really differ, except for one crime, which is homicides. When they examine non-gun homicides, both cities experience about the same rate of homicides. It's when they examine gun homicides, they see a drastic disparity between the 2 cities. You're about 5 times more likely to be killed by a handgun in Seattle than you are in Vancouver. The author suggests this is because it is very difficult to legally obtain a handgun in Vancouver and relatively easy to obtain a handgun in Seattle. For this next part, we'll listen to a very brief part of a podcast from Freakonomics, where they discuss one of the most interesting reads on violence in inner cities, Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun. If I had more time this semester, I would assign this book. Here it is.
I remember when you and I first started working together and we started talking about, we knew we were going to be writing about crime and therefore violence and therefore guns. And we started talking about Jeff Canada's book, Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun. And it led to this conversation where we wrote, here, I'm going to read you, Levitt, a couple sentences that we ended up writing. It might be worthwhile to take a step back and ask a rudimentary question. What is a gun? It's a tool that can be used to kill someone, of course, but more significantly, a gun is a great disruptor of the natural order. I wonder if you could just talk about that for a minute. When you think of a gun disrupting, changing the equation of the way that people interact with and fight each other, the way they did hundreds or thousands of years ago at least, how does the gun as a kind of, intervening instrument just change the whole dynamic of the way that people relate to each other or against each other?
Yeah, you might think that having a lot of guns around would be great for reducing violence. It's the same theory that works with nuclear deterrence. When you have a weapon that's incredibly powerful, no one wants to fight because the costs of fighting are so high. Okay, but why is it in the context of guns, we don't think about guns as deterrence, we think about guns as causing the violence? And the idea here comes out of Canada's book, Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun, which honestly I'll say is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. If it's still in print, I would just encourage people to go find it. It's fantastically insightful. And what Canada talks about is that in the old days, in the 50s and 60s, when there weren't that many guns around, disputes would be resolved with fistfights or maybe with knives. Okay, and the thing is, look, when you fight someone who's much bigger and stronger than you, you know who's going to win. And if you already know who's going to win, you don't need to fight. Because if you know you're going to lose, why bother? Okay, and so actually in that setting, when disputes are decided by fighting, with your fists, you don't have to have many fights because there's not a lot of uncertainty. Okay, but guns, okay, and this is Canada's point, guns really destroy that order because anybody with a gun can beat anybody without a gun, right? It doesn't matter how strong you are, whether you're popular or unpopular. The gun basically makes it so that uncertainty of the outcome of the fight is immense. And then that actually has the opposite effect of deterrence, because now if anybody can win the fight, there can be more fights, because it's not like you've got a certain winner and a certain loser, which means that you don't have to fight in the first place. And I think that that's a really powerful idea. It's a subtle idea, but one that is really at the heart of why guns are related to violence, but nuclear weapons have not been ever used since we did it the first time, when no one had them on the other side to scare us off from using them.
Okay. They suggest a gun is a great disruptor of the natural order. Is this true? This is really the question you're trying to answer for this writing assignment. Do guns change the behavior of people? Are gun-carrying individuals more likely to put themselves in dangerous situations because they have a gun on their side? Are they more likely to intervene in arguments between people knowing they have the upper hand? Well, what if the other person also has a concealed gun? Now what? We often hear the slogan, people kill people, not guns. Someone has to pull the trigger, right? No one is making them do it, right? To a basic extent, that is absolutely correct. But do guns make you do things you wouldn't otherwise do? In other words, before you pull the trigger, did it influence your behavior in a bar argument? Did it influence your yelling or instigating in an altercation? Were you in a place you wouldn't otherwise be? Let me make an analogy to another tool that we don't normally think of as having power or influence over our behavior. Smartphones. Are we fully in control of our phone's behavior, or is it in control of us? How could it influence how humans behave? That doesn't even make sense, right? Or does it? If you grew up in a time before cell phones, you might remember how people used to behave. Think about that for a second. Did you ever see people carrying their landline phone with them to the dinner table while they ate with their families? But now that you have a mobile device which fits in your pocket very easily, you're more likely to carry it with you everywhere you go, including the dinner table. In fact, you put it right on the table next to you, don't you? Why do you need it so bad? Who's that important that's going to call you at dinner time? I do this. I don't even know why I do it, but I know it's a bad habit, and I never did this when I was a kid, in part because you look like an idiot carrying your landline phone to the dinner table. And because there was no texting, right? Since when is everybody an amateur photographer all of a sudden? Did people in the 1980s and 1990s used to bring their Polaroid or Nikon cameras, if they had one of course, with them everywhere they went in order to capture some amazing moment or take a picture of their creme brulee dessert? No one used to do that before, because if they did it, they'd have to do a number of steps in order to share that moment with other people they cared about. First, you'd have to bring this very clunky camera with you everywhere you went, which of course does not fit into your pockets, but perhaps it did fit in your fanny pack, right? If you brought a camera with you, it was because that day or vacation was going to be a big deal. Second, you'd have to take enough photos to finish the roll so that you can get it developed at the local CVS or Walgreens. Then you'd have to wait a couple of hours to get those pictures back. And of course, another impediment, you'd have to pay for it. You better hope those photos are worth it. Okay, now that you have the photos, and you of course you have to make copies of the photos you want to share, right? You can now mail them to your friends by putting a stamp on each envelope and putting them in the mailbox. Some days later, your friends would get a photo of you eating some type of fettuccine with clams dish in a darkly lit room, and hopefully, just hopefully, they'd still be your friends after wasting their time with such a ridiculous photo. So what the heck changed? Smartphones, fast internet speeds, and social media apps. Almost everyone now carries a phone with them at all times, and most of these phones are equipped with really great cameras. You want to take a photo of something? No problem. Just yank out your phone camera device out of your pocket and voila. You just took a photo with a really great camera. You want to let your friends know what photo you just took? No problem. You can email, text, or submit it through Instagram so that your friends or the whole world can see some photo you just took within a matter of seconds. It didn't cost you anything, and you didn't have to go through much trouble to post or attach the photo. Because it's easy to do, we see this type of behavior more often. It's no different than our discussion of crime and opportunity. Crimes that are easier to do will be done more often. The more difficult you make it, carrying a clunky camera with bad resolution, developing it at CVS, making extra copies, mailing it to your friends, the less likely it occurs. Did people really change over the last 20 years? Or did smartphones change the way people behave? Take a look at the findings from a recent survey from the Pew Research Center. It shows how Americans feel about using their cell phone in certain public arenas. So you can see walking down the street, most people find that it's okay to be talking on your phone or using your phone. On public transportation, most people find it fine while waiting in line. Again, about 3/4 people find it fine. Where we see less people being fine with certain behavior in the public arena is at a restaurant. Most people are against that. At family dinner, 9 out of 10 people are against that. During a meeting, nearly everyone is against that. At the movie theater, or other places where others are usually quiet. At church, again, 96% are against it. Somehow, 4% are totally okay with that. And you can Google this website on your own. They show the age demographics of people who are okay with all these behaviors. Guess who's more approving of these behaviors towards that bottom of the list? Dinner, meeting, movie theater, church. Young people, the 18 to 29 demographic. Of the people who are okay with it, most likely to be the 18 to 29 demographic, right? These are the people who didn't grow up in a time without cell phones, right? Okay, now back to the question at hand. Do guns change the behavior of its owners, or are owners of guns in complete control of their tools? In the Times article by Charles Blow, there's a table of interest, and unfortunately the first link I provided, they no longer allowed to be zoomed in. I've just provided a new link so you can see it much clearer. Let me pull it out now. The first three categories are number of firearm homicide rate, number of firearm homicides, and average firearm ownership. The gray color boxes means low numbers or rates, orange yellowish color means medium, and red means high. In the first column, the firearm homicide rate, notice where the U.S. is. The firearm homicide rate, the U.S. has the highest with 3.2 homicides per 100,000 people. No other country comes close. Take, for example, Switzerland, which has the second highest rate at 0.8, which tells us that the Swiss are 4 times less likely to be shot dead controlling for population. Again, they're in second place, we're in first. Huge disparity. In the second column, the U.S. has the highest firearm homicide total with just under 10,000. Again, notice the raw numbers here. Switzerland, 57 homicides per year. Italy, 417. No other country even comes remotely close to the U.S. In the third column, the U.S. also has the highest average firearm ownership rate with about 88 guns per 100 persons, right? Again, seeing the next highest, we're in the 40-30 range, right? Switzerland comes in second, right, but only has about half as many guns per 100 persons at 45.7. The last three categories are assault death rate, assault or threat rate, and child injury deaths. Let's just focus on the first two because this tells you something about the nature of the people of each OECD nation. If some nations are naturally violent, what crime category would you want to investigate that is independent of gun violence? Assaults. This tells us if some people like to solve many of their problems with physical violence, as well as the likelihood of being assaulted on the street unprovoked. Now, the assault rate is really an important measure because if you believe Americans are just more violent in nature, then they'd light up in red. Right? And in fact, they do. The U.S. is in the top 6 for assault or threat rate. Right? This column right here. But they are one of the lowest in the top 6. Look at the other countries that are red in this column. The Netherlands, Iceland, Ireland, United Kingdom, and New Zealand. So people in these countries actually fight a lot, as much, if not more, than Americans do. The only difference is that they live another day after getting into a fight. In the US, if you get into a violent altercation, it's more likely to involve a gun, and as a consequence, it's more likely to result in death. Gunshot wound victims have a 90% chance of dying, right? Give or take a couple percentage points, depending on the type of study we've looked at. So look at these numbers very carefully, comparing each of these high-income OECD nations, and see if you can figure out what is causing such a high homicide rate in the U.S. compared to other nations. This next slideshow shows the homicide rate more clearly. You'll notice here that it includes some non-high-income OECD nations like Turkey and Chile, which are middle-income OECD nations. Here we see another graph that correlates gun deaths and gun ownership as a percentage within the population. What is the general pattern that you see? Finally, we look at Australia. Some 20 years ago, they had a terrible mass shooting in Australia. As a response, the Conservative government at the time banned most guns from its citizens and created a massive buyback program to rid the streets of guns. Read this article on your own, it's on Blackboard. So researchers recently evaluated whether these considerable gun restrictions actually has led to less homicides in Australia over time. As you can see in this figure, gun deaths considerably declined since 1996. You're about 3 times less likely to be killed with a gun in Australia now as compared to the late 1980s. But what if people are just being killed by other means, right? So gun homicides went down, but what about non-gun homicides? Who the hell cares how people are being killed? What matters is that people are still being killed at the same rate. As a rate, we see both types of homicides have decreased since 1996. You're less likely to be killed in Australia with or without a gun. Offenders did not simply change their weapons. They seemed to not act on their impulses without a gun in their hand. So that's it for this week. I hope this information is helpful and makes you think about what causes homicides to be so high in the U.S. as compared to other Western developed nations. I'll see you next time.